our event, Hanging Out with Galileo, The Man, His Life, His Science, a talk by Dr. Luciano Canova. I am Arianna Dagnino, and I am the Cultural Events Coordinator of the Dante Alighieri Society of BC, a non-profit organization that promotes Italian language and culture. We have the Dante Italian Language School as part of our mission in the way we promote Italian language through Italian language courses. The spring session will start in April 12th, on April 12th. And we have courses from beginners to advanced, at all levels. We also have a conversation 1 and 2 courses and a course on Italian for travelers in preparation for when we'll be able to travel again to Italy. I always remind you to either to become a member of the Dante Society. The yearly membership costs $30, or to make a donation, because that's the way we can keep on, organizing and offering this kind of events to the society at large, to the community at large here in Vancouver. And not only here in Vancouver, we have people also connecting from Seattle, from other parts of the world. And so let me just also introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Luciano Canova, who holds a PhD in economics at the Università Cattolica of Milan and was a postdoc researcher at the Paris School of Economics. He currently teaches in the master program called MEDEA, Management of Environmental and Energy Economics, born from a partnership between the Enrico Mattei School and the University of Pavia. Luciano Canova is the author of several books on science and economics, including Galileo Reloaded, The Scientific Method in the Post-Truth Age. So without further ado, let me join you in welcoming Luciano Canova on our virtual podium.
Thank you very much, Arianna, and hello everybody. I'm very happy and very pleased to give this talk for the Dante Society in such a day, because we are just one day after what in Italy has been called the Dante D, which means the day of Dante, because 25 of March is always the day of Dante, because supposedly is the start of the journey of the poet in Inferno. And yesterday there have been many events all around the web in Italy about celebrating the poet, especially this year, which is the 700th year after his death. And let me say that we will talk a little bit now. I'm sharing my screen about Galileo Galilei. So this talk is just a way of presenting an amazing guy, an amazing man, an amazing scientist. But let me just say that Galileo Galilei was also a great expert of Dante Alighieri. When he was very young, he was actually studying a lot literature and Dante Alighieri, and as a scientist was supposed to present the structure of the universe using a painting made by Sandro Botticelli about the structure of the Inferno. And when Galileo, as a young student, was still Ptolemaic, was presenting using Dante Alighieri the physical structure of the Inferno. So just to say that this gives you immediately one of the characteristics of Galileo Galilei, is eclectic brain. He's really a guy that works with many different languages. I apologize for my Italian English, but I hope you will follow my presentation, which is dealing actually with what I was writing in the book Galileo Reloaded. That is a book which is a sort of biography of Galileo Galilei, but written in a more pop way. So let me start. If my, okay, yes. I'm starting with an exercise. I don't know if you are like me, but this is Google Earth. And let's see if the video starts. There is no, I just pointed a precise place, which is INAF, Istituto Nazionale di Astrofisica, National Institute of Astrophysics, which is placed in Arcetri in Tuscany, basically where Galileo Galilei was spending his very last years of his life when he was confined by the church in his villa, Il Gioiello. And now that place is the place of one of the most important astrophysical observatory in Europe. So it's like an homage to the guy. And I like Google Earth because if you think about it, Google Earth is actually the realization of the philosophy of Galileo Galilei. I don't know if you are like me. I always relax myself by playing with Google Earth because this is a really amazing way of looking at how we are placed in our planet, in our very small planet. It gives you the possibility of understanding pretty much how insignificant human beings may be. And in a sense, Galileo Galilei was the guy that firstly, or I mean, thanks to the possibility of giving diffusion and importance to the Copernican theory, put the Earth at the periphery of the universe. So it really changed the perspective according to which we look at human beings. I mean, I use the adjective insignificant, but let me clarify that I think that Galileo Galilei, with his science and his life, gives a central role to human beings and to their responsibility and to their dignity as creatures that make mistakes. And this will be a small talk giving you a little glance into the amazing life of these amazing scientists. First of all, since Arianna was presenting me, I am an economist. You may ask yourself, why does an economist talk about Galileo Galilei? Because indeed, that could be a good question. And there is a bunch of answers for that. First of all, as a social scientist, I'm pretty interested in philosophy of science. And Galileo Galilei is even more famous now as a contributor to philosophy of science, because indeed he's considered quite correctly, I would say, the father of scientific method. So in terms of epistemology, a behavioral economist works with the method introduced by Galileo Galilei. So actually, I am really interested in the methodology with which experiments are set up. We live in a world where we just have been experiencing the importance of experiments. If you think about the speed at which vaccines against COVID have been developed in this year, this is actually the amazing power of the experimental method. And again, it's something that starts as a systematic approach thanks to the works of Galileo Galilei. But more than that, I have to say that I have a passion for this guy since I was a little child. Because when I was at primary school, my teacher, I mean, Galileo Galilei is very famous in Italy, but I think that more or less everybody at least is familiar with his face. He's a pretty famous face all over the world, and he's a pretty famous guy all over the world. But especially in Italy, when you are in primary school, that is a way to start educating pupils to science, because there is the legend that he was making experiments from the top of the Tower of Pisa, throwing weights in order to understand the role of attrition. Actually, it is supposed to be false, but that is a story that is told. And then there is the story of the telescope. And actually, my teacher was really good in engaging me with the passion and the life for this guy. More than that, I'm showing here a banknote. At the beginning of the 80s of the last centuries, Galileo Galilei was the face of the banknote of 2,000 lira. Actually, more or less is 1 euro. And as a little child, that was the banknote that I used when I was going to buy the sports figures of soccer players. We call them figurine. There is a very famous company in Italy, Figurine Panini. When you are a child, the other passion of Italian is football, you go and buy the sports figures. So I was always using my first money with the face of Galileo Galilei. And Galileo Galilei has a face very interesting because he always is represented as an old guy with his beard, and he's also sort of angry in most of the pictures that you may observe. Well, here he's pointing up, but as I'm using an adjective and asking Arianna to help me to translate, he has an expression that can be defined as burbero.
So I would say unfriendly, grouchy, unsociable, surly.
Okay, and actually he was. I mean, if you go into the readings of Galileo Galilei, he was a very, I mean, he was a guy very able to
grouchy.
Grouchy. It was very grouchy. I mean, it was blasting. I mean, if I can use a kind of very actual word, it was blasting people that were saying stupid things about science. And I mean, it's amazing to read. I will go through some of these episodes because it's really funny. I mean, he had a great irony and he was grouchy. I mean, he was so sure of his ideas that somehow was very happy to defend them. But this is actually a first signal of one of his main characteristics: passion and enthusiasm for his ideas. I think that all along his life, till the very end of his life, because Galileo Galilei, let me say that, is a peculiar scientist in that one of the most important books he writes, Discorso sopra le due nuove scienze, Discourse over the two new sciences, was published when he was at the very end of his life in a very miserable condition, and he was 78 years old. If you go into the literature of history of science, you will see that most likely art scientists are very productive in the very young age. I mean, between 30 and 40 years typically, while Galileo Galilei was very productive till the very end of his life. I mean, he was blind, but he was continuing to work on experiments, and a systematic book like Discorso sopra le due nuove scienze, which is considered his heritage to the world of physics today. And then, just to go a little bit into personal, I was so in love with Galileo Galilei that I asked, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I asked my father to buy me for Christmas as a present the telescope, because I really wanted to look at the stars. I'm still a very, very amatorial astronomy somehow. I have a small telescope. And I asked my father to buy me the telescope. But in the morning of Christmas, when I went under the trees and I opened the box of the gift, you can imagine my reaction when I found, opening the box, a microscope. So my father, instead of buying me a telescope, bought me a microscope. So in a second, I went from the magnitude of the stars to the micro level of elementary particles, and that was my reaction. So at first, I really cried because it was exactly the opposite of what I asked. But again, I need to thank Galileo Galilei, because Galileo Galilei is very famous to be the inventor of the telescope, and he's not. I mean, actually, he was sort of the inventor of the killing up of the telescope, but the telescope was already there, invented by some Dutch voyagers, while Galileo had the idea of using the telescope for astronomical observations, while at the Osservatorio Astronomico di Milano Brera, Astronomical Observatory of Brera, Milan, there is the patent of one of the microscopes that Galileo Galilei was inventing. So although he concentrated his life on the observation of stars, indeed he may be considered one of the guys that actually invented the microscope. So I now thank my father, because indeed that was a present that could be nice enough, even because that is connected to the life of Galileo. And then getting into the amazing multidimensionality of the personality of Galileo, when I grew a little bit as a high school student, I was surprised to read this guy is a very famous Italian poet, Ungaretti, who is a very famous poet of the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the most famous poets in Italy wrote about Galileo. I'm reading in Italian and then I'm trying to translate, asking also for Arianna to help me there, because I don't want to translate such a beautiful sentence with mistakes. Ungaretti, talking about Galileo, says, reca nella terminologia un rigore direi quasi crudele, pure lasciando che la lingua scapricci a suo agio nella fantasia. Which is an amazing sentence, combining the two great characteristics of the writings of Galileo. He is very rigorous, so as a scientist, he is very rigorous, but at the same time, thanks to his humanistic background, he is an amazing writer. So he uses metaphors like this, and it is amazing to read Galileo after centuries for an Italian. It is really a very entertaining reading, although he's a scientist and talks about physics. And to add on that, another great writer, maybe Italo Calvino is more famous even in Canada. He is one of the greatest novelists of the Italian literature of the 20th century. And in a letter written to Corriere della Sera, after the publication of one of his books, at some point he writes, the greatest writer of Italian literature of any time, Galileo. So again, I was astonished because one of the greatest novelists talks about a scientist like one of the greatest writer of the Italian literature. And indeed, if you go into the reading of Galileo, you will find that what Italo Calvino says is not so far from truth. Because again, Galileo is able to talk about science in a very pop way, somehow, for his time. And he's amazing in using images. So I actually was even more fascinated by this personality. Now, in order again to get a little bit into Galileo, let's make together an exercise to understand the kind of jump that Galileo Galilei did and made human beings do thanks to his work. Let's make a simulated bungee jumping together. So we are in 2021, and let's ask ourselves what happened 100 years ago. So we are in 2021. What happened in 1921? Well, actually, the cinema was already there, of course, with very different technology, mute movies, but Charlie Chaplin was coming out with his The Kid. So actually, it was possible for human beings to entertain themselves with movies, going to the cinema and watch a movie. So actually, things have changed, but not so much in 100 years. There is still cinema. Now we use Netflix and some other streaming platforms, but still, actually, the kind of entertaining is the same. Now I'm talking like an Italian passionate of football. 100 years ago, there was already the league of Serie A. Serie A is the major league of football in Italy. And I'm a supporter of Inter Milan, and there was Inter Milan. The only difference is that different teams were winning the league. The league of 1921 has been won by Pro Vercelli. Vercelli is a small town close to Turin in Piemonte. Now it's not such a big team, but still, football was there with Serie A, cinemas were there. And if we go into geography, this was a map, one of the many maps that you could find and use in 1921. And actually, if you are with me, you can recognize that this is still in 2 dimensions, the idea of the world that we are. Of course, everything has been changed politically speaking, but the geography of the map is exactly the map where we studied when we were children, okay? So I don't know if in Canada it's like in Italy, when you are a child, in each classroom, there is a big map, a planisphere like that. I don't know if in United States or in North America is at the center of the planisphere, because what typically changes is that depending on the perspective, you can find Europe, North America, or China at the center of the planisphere, but that's the only difference. For the rest, the shape of the continents is exactly the same. So this is actually what happened 100 years ago. Now let's try to make the same exercise for Galileo Galilei, asking ourselves what happened 100 years before Galileo was born. Galileo was born in 1564, which means that in 1464, what happened? Actually, in 1464, there was not even the idea of discovering a new continent. that was going to happen in 30 years. And this very famous map, and it's very, very important for people like you living in North America, is called Walse-Muller map. It is a map that a geographer has published in 1507, and now is conserved in the National Library at Washington, because this is the first map in history, apparently, that uses the word America for the new continent. We are talking about 1507. So just to understand the kind of jump, 100 years before Galileo, the world was radically different. We always talk about globalization and things that have changed in our time, but the real big jump made by human beings in history is really the globalization due to the discovery of the new continent that really changed dramatically the history of humankind. So 100 years before Galileo, the situation was like this. And 100 years, I mean, at the time of Galileo, this was the map of the universe available with the geocentric theory, the Ptolemaic model that puts at the very center, standing still, planet Earth, and everything that revolves around planet Earth in the universe, including the sun, all the stars, all the astronomical body. So the jump made by Galileo, putting the Earth at the periphery of the universe, moving around the sun, is something that, in my opinion, is astonishing. If you think about the kind of mental jump that human beings needed to make in order to self-perceive themselves in this new model. Now we started with Google Earth. It's like to have the perception of the subject in the planet and in the universe, and it's radically different from what was going on a few years before Galileo. So the challenge was really, really a tough one. And now let's ask ourselves, who was Galileo? I'm trying to answer with a few points, giving you points of all his characteristics. First of all, I already mentioned that, but I'm going a little bit deeper into that. Galileo Galilei was a great communicator. So actually, Copernican book was there since years, but nobody was talking about it. It became very famous because Galileo was starting to write and talk in Italian about the Copernican theory. And that actually switched on the attention of the church and of the Collegio dei Gesuiti. But this is because of his amazing ability to communicate theory that may be difficult in a very simple way. Just to give an example that I always quote, and it comes from Dialogo sopra i due massimi sistemi. In order to, I mean, this is a typical way of Galileo to use metaphors. So in order to let people understand the unreliability of the Ptolemaic models, he writes something like that. The Ptolemaic model claims that the whole universe revolves around the Earth in 24 hours. The thing is a bit arrogant. It would be as if you were climbing the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. Galileo Galilei was living his life in Florence most of the time. I mean, he's in Tuscany. So Santa Maria del Fiore is the dome of Florence. And to see Florence, you would expect the city to revolve around it. I think it's an amazing way and very, very immediate to give the idea of the unreliability of the Ptolemaic model. And if you think about it, this is exactly the concept that is behind Google Maps, because when you point a place in Google Maps, you can actually, using Street View, to see the city revolving around you. So he had a great ability to intuit it, to have an intuition, and also to represent it. Then, this is very important. Galileo Galilei was a man with a redundant ego. I mean, this is not so rare if you look at the history of science, because now, I mean, I'm showing here very different people. And I mean, if you go into the biography of scientists, most of the time you will find that most of them have a huge personality. Isaac Newton was another guy with a bad character, apparently. He was spending most of his life in a conflict, in a rivalry against another scientist, Robert Hooke. Isaac Newton is one of the founders of Royal Society, and he was really, really bad in behaving against this guy. And he was really, really very confident about his skills. Albert Einstein as well is very famous. I mean, not only because he was a revolutionary scientist with his contribution to physics, but he was one of the guys that was more able to make communication of science pop at this time. I mean, his face is like an icon now. And again, if you go into the personal life of Albert Einstein, he had many problems at the time of Me Too. I think he would be a little bit in problems because he was really bad with his wife, Milena. And actually, there are lots of books about it that show that his behavior was not so nice. I put at the very end a guy that is the exception. If you go into the life of Charles Darwin is an amazing man. He's an amazing human being. I say that because I was reading a few biographies, and all of the biographies confirm that. Actually, differently than other scientists, Charles Darwin was a very humble man, so humble that he was so scared of his own discovery of the origin of species that it took 27 years before publishing the books, because he really wanted to be sure about the results of his experiments before publishing a book that was supposed to basically radically change the perspective of human beings. And differently than Einstein, his relationship with his wife, Emma, is really romantic. The wife was was a believer, while he was not. And because he didn't want to basically ruin the fate of his wife for God, he left her messages for when he was supposed to die in order to remember him. I mean, he was a really very, very kind guy. Galileo is a super redundant ego. And I'm showing here, I mean, this is the Porsche Cayenne. Porsche Cayenne in Italy, just to give you a glance into cultural life in Italy, Porsche Cayenne is the typical car used by people rich, but they also want to show them as rich, okay? In Italian, we have a few words like tamarro. I don't know if Arianna can help me in translating that. I mean, typical people that really want to show their richness, and actually they are kind of kitsch somehow. So the Porsche Cayenne is for a very high level income, but at the same time is not very elegant. I don't know if I'm able to transfer the concept.
A bit vulgar, yes. We would say cheesy.
Cheesy, okay, yes. Perfect. And when Galileo Galilei was I mean, at some point in his life, he was a little bit more than 40 years old. He got very famous in Europe because of the use of the telescope. Because of the use of the telescope, he got many offers. One of them was to be back in Florence. He was teaching at the University of Padova, and then he got an offer to be back in Florence. And it's really, really interesting to go through the letters and the negotiations of the contract, because Galileo wanted to be back in Tuscany. And this is a typical peculiar characteristics of Italian, because Italian are very campanilisti. I don't know how I can translate campanilisti.
So it's a way of saying, we would say parochialism, parochialist.
Okay, yeah, because everybody is very attached to his own birthplace, and Galileo was very attached to his birthplace as well. So when he was young, he needed to leave Florence because he could not get a job there, and he went to Padova. When he had the chance to get back in Florence, he wanted to get back with a sort of sense of revenge. So in his negotiation, he not only asked for a huge salary, a lot of privileges, but he also asked the Grand Duke of Tuscany to have the possibility of enter the city of Florence using the royal litter of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So this is my way of showing the Porsche Cayenne, because Galileo enters the city of Florence using the royal litter of the Grand Duke, just to show that kind of personality. I mean, this is a really, really strong personality, not that friendly, but still very interesting to investigate. Then Galileo, I don't know if you know, was a dropout. I mean, because his career path as a student is a career path of failures. He started to study medicine and he never graduated. Then he decided to study mathematics, but he never graduated in mathematics as well. He started teaching mathematics, but he never graduated. So he's a dropout. I'm using here the expression because I want also to make clear something that sometimes creates a misunderstanding, because there is this saying or bias. Some people claim that there is so many famous persons that are not graduating and they are very successful men that maybe the degree or or studying at university is not worthwhile. I don't know if it happens also in Canada, but sometimes you can listen that, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates never graduated and were able to fund very, very successful corporates. So maybe it's not so important to graduate. But this is really a clear misunderstanding, because we just look at few positive cases without considering the big picture. The big picture is very different. If you go into the statistics of people working in a university, big corporation, the huge majority of people that have high qualified jobs have a university degree, and also think that the university degree and studying at university is very important. And then, very important as well, although Galileo, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs are dropout, all of them could not be what they are and were without the university. I mean, if you think about Galileo, he actually spent all his life in university. I mean, University of Padova was central for his life. Although he was not graduated, without the University of Padova, he could not know Paolo Sarpi, and Paolo Sarpi was an historian that made him discover the telescope. So the university was strategic for the innovation that Galileo was then using to change the world of science. Mark Zuckerberg, without Harvard University, could not invent or steal Facebook. I don't even understand what is the correct verb here, but still, the innovation of the platform Facebook was invented in Harvard. And the same applies to Steve Jobs. His passion for design was developed in Stanford, although he was not giving any exam. Without the possibility of meeting and contaminating culturally with other students at Stanford, the passion for design, that is the typical sign of Apple, could not be developed. So this is just to say that I think that with the legend of the dropout, we need to make clear that university and studying at university and living at university is really important. A university education is important to provide human capital that is what make a human being very productive for his long life perspective. Then Galileo was also a scientist with a great intuition. So thanks to him, few new concepts have been introduced in science. In particular, I'm just giving an example with a funny way. So unfortunately, the Hollywood directors of Godzilla didn't have the chance of hiring Galileo as a consultant, because if you think about Godzilla, who is a very big lizard, maybe you can imagine that Godzilla write to Galileo this letter: "Dear Galileo, rumors around say that you are a misunderstood genius. Are you by any chance also a good fighter? I challenge you to a fight to death. Time and address will follow. Firmato, signed, Godzilla." Because what's the point? I mean, but Galileo would have easily accepted the fight with Godzilla, because Godzilla is physically impossible to exist. Why that? Because of the law of the square cube. I mean, I think that in English, the law is the square cube law. What is the law of the square cube law, which is amazingly important for engineer? I'm providing a very easy example. Here there is a square and a cube. So let's start easy. If we have a square of 1 decimeter side, if we compute the area of that square is the side times the side, so 1 times 1 square decimeter. Okay, are you with me? Very easy. The volume of that cube of 1 with the square of 1 decimeter side is 1 times 1 times 1, because now there is also the third dimension. So it's 1 decimeter to the power of 3. But now let's imagine to double the side of the square. So we shift from a square of 1 decimeter side to a square of 2 decimeter side. Now the area is going to be 2 times 2, 4 square decimeter. Very easy. The volume is the cube of the linear dimension, because it's 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. So what's the problem is that as long as you increase the linear dimension, the area, the surface increases with the power of that dimension, but the volume increases with the cube of that dimension. So what does it mean intuitively? That if you have a flat and you increase the dimension of the flat, you will need energy to heat it more than proportionally as long as you increase the dimension of the flat. That's a very important principle for structural engineering. If you want to build skyscrapers or big buildings, you need to consider the square of the law of the square volume, because the problem is that as long as you increase dimension, the volume increases with the cube of the linear dimension, which means that you need more strength in the pillars in order to sustain that weight. So the only consequence of having something like Godzilla is that it's not physically possible, because with that proportion, he could not stay on his legs. And I mean, this is actually something that Galileo writes when thinking about when has the intuition of the law, and in the discorso sopra le due nuove scienze talks about the fact that if you think about big animals need more time to eat themselves. I mean, elephant needs more time to eat with respect to mice, and the same applies for a big insect. You cannot see big insect because of this law. So this is an amazing ability of having intuitions. Then, very important, and I'm getting close to the end, Galileo is one of the first debunkers in history. I mean, and this is actually what I like and what I study as a social scientist. The use of the scientific method is very important for Galileo, because he's one of the first guys that uses logic, rationality, and experiments in order to demystify hoaxes or fake news, let's say. I mean, although this is not the word that Galileo, of course, was using. Let's go into an episode. 1618. 1618 was a very important year in Europe, the beginning of the War of the 30 Years. That was very important. And astronomically speaking, 1618 was an amazing year, because something very strange happened. So one comet appeared in the sky that is labeled C1618Q1, but most importantly, 2 other comets in the same year appear in the sky. C 1618 V1 and C 1618 W1. So imagine 3 comets appearing in the sky in 1618, and this is a world in which the Ptolemaic model is still there. So the sky is the world of the Aristotelian perfection, the 5th essence. In theory, the sky is the world of immutability and perfection. Comets are something that are very different, are very strange to understand and interpret. So there was a huge debate in the scientific community about the origin and the nature of comets. And Galileo, that at the time was a little bit more than 50 years old, so already a little bit old, was in bed because he was suffering for the entire year with rheumatic pains that he got for his young years in Padova. So he was in bed and he was not able to observe with the telescope the comet. But nonetheless, he entered the debate. And unfortunately, he entered the debate against this guy, Orazio Grassi. Orazio Grassi was a Jesuit. Come si dice Jesuita in inglese?
Jesuit is okay.
Okay. And an astronomer, an Aristotelian astronomer, that was writing a few pamphlets about the origin and nature of comets. In particular, one very famous pamphlet is the Libra Astronomica ac Philosophica. Libra in Latin means balance. So balance, bilancia è balance, no?
Scale.
Okay, so he was writing this pamphlet, and actually the theory of Orazio Grassi was that comets are astronomical bodies that are outside the atmosphere. And we have to say, after 4 centuries, that it was right. I mean, comets are astronomical bodies that are outside the atmosphere. But very interestingly, Orazio Grassi is right using the wrong arguments, because to defend his theory, use very qualitative arguments. I mean, at the time, being an Aristotelian scientist means that you refer to the principle of authority. What does it mean? That if Aristotle said something in one of his books, that something must be true and cannot be put into discussion. And this is actually the way in which Orazio Grassi defends its thesis. While Galileo Galilei was wrong, because actually his idea was that comets were a problem of perception, an optical illusion created by the refraction of solar light. But he was wrong with the right arguments, because he was using for the time the empirical evidence available. And it's amazing the way in which Galileo faces Orazio Grassi. First of all, I was saying that Orazio publishes a pamphlet that is called Libra. Libra is a balance, a scale that was used to weight vegetables and fruit. And Galileo will write a book that is called Il Saggiatore. Saggiatore in Italian was the term with which balances were defined, but balance is used to weight silver and gold. So even in the title, you may understand that he's saying, okay, you are weighting fruit and vegetables, I'm weighting silver and gold, so I'm more refined than you. And then he entered with a very, very, I think I will going to use the same adjective as before, grouchy conflict with this guy, because at the Museo Galilei in Florence, it's very interesting because you can see the copy of the pamphlet of Orazio Grassi that Galileo was reading, and he was writing notes on that. Okay, so Galileo was at bed, was reading the pamphlet of his rival, and he was putting notes aside. Okay, like when you put notes on a paper. And it's very interesting to see what Galileo writes, because at some point Orazio Grassi says, ego enim professor sum. In Latin means, in fact, I am a teacher, I am a professor, okay? Galileo puts a line on the sentence and write, no, tu sei un coglione. And I mean, it's amazingly funny the way in which he writes. And then he starts writing bufalaccio, pezzo d'asinaccio, temerario bestiolo, solennissimo bue. All the pamphlet is full of these insulti, offenses. But the point is that after that, it destroys the arguments of Orazio Grassi with an amazing metaphor. Because going against the principle of auctoritas, one of the arguments used by Orazio Grassi was particularly weird. In particular, Orazio Grassi was saying, comets are bodies that basically eat themselves in contact with air, and the heat make them get fire, okay? So in order to say that something like that is reasonable, Orazio Grassi says, Aristotle, in one of his writings, describes what happened in ancient Babylonia. Because in ancient Babylonia, apparently, young men were cooking their eggs. They were preparing boiled eggs with frusta, come si dice?
With a whipper.
With a whip. So using whippers, so imagine to have a whipper, you put the egg on the whipper, you start rotating the whipper in the air, and because of that, the egg gets cooked. So this was something incredibly stupid, I mean, and that was the reaction of Galileo. So Galileo say, okay, you say that Aristotle said it, but what I want to do is to make an experiment, because actually we can do an experiment, because we have slingshots or whippers. So we fionda, non frusta.
So a slingshot, yes.
We have the slingshots, so we can use them. We have the eggs, so we can put eggs in the slingshot. We have strong young men, and we can ask them to rotate the slingshots in the air. I did that, but eggs do not cook, so it doesn't work. So, hence, as a scientist, what writes Galileo? The only thing we miss, if you think about it, is that we have not anymore ancient Babylonians. So, conclusion, it is the fact of being Babylonians that determine whether the eggs are cooked or not, which I think is the best way of presenting the experimental method so far in centuries that I ever read. I actually laughed when reading this argument, but I think it's a very clever way of isolating the relationship between a cause and an effect. And so, again, this is an episode showing amazingly the power of communication of Galileo. And this is actually what I use today when I talk with my students about the difference between correlation and causation. I mean, this is a graph showing on the x-axis, the number of pirates as they come from the registry of the British Army in the centuries. And on the y-axis, there is the average temperature register on planet Earth. So you see that there is a positive relationship. You may be tempted to say, okay, as long as there is more pirates, the temperature in planet Earth increases. But this is completely wrong. I mean, correlation is not causation. And let's go very delicate and actual. When you think about vaccines, I mean, in Europe now, there is a huge debate. A vaccine, AstraZeneca, has been stopped exactly because of this mistake. Because there is people that die after getting a jab of the vaccine, but that is just a correlation. The fact that the vaccine causes to die is something very different. And I mean, this is actually the legacy of Galileo Galilei that we really need to make as familiar as possible, because people are getting biased because of that. And actually in Italy, I have to say, for an entire week, the vaccine campaign has been blocked because of this, because of a problem of correlation that has been confounded as a causation problem. So Galileo is really needed now. Okay, so I am actually close to the end, and I think that the main insight coming from the life of Galileo is this one: be curious, make mistakes, and continue searching. The life of Galileo was full of mistakes. full of wrong ideas. But luckily enough, thanks to his method, we have the possibility of verifying that ideas are wrong. And I put here another sentence from an Italian writer, Gesualdo Bufalino, and I'm asking again Arianna to assist me, because I really like it. Il dubbio è una passerella che trema tra l'errore e la verità. So doubt is a sort of path, trembling path, that trembles between mistakes and truth. And I think that this is the big legacy of Galileo. He gave mistakes the dignity. He gave doubts the possibility of being at the center of human life, against a life of certainties that, again, is not what really happened in reality. So I really think that the big legacy of Galileo is this humbleness in the end, although he was definitely not humble, of being able to understand that we may make mistake and we can actually change our path if we make mistake, using data as the main way to find the correct path. Ending up, I always make this exercise when I end up this sort of talk. Patiently count to 60, so for 1 minute. And in 1 minute, planet Earth has already traveled, rotating as around its axis, for 18 kilometers. So we always forget that we live in an amazing spaceship altogether, that in 1 minute makes 18 kilometers, and we don't realize that we do that. In its circle around the sun, in 365 days, the average cruising speed is more than 106,000 kilometers per hour. So we are in planet Earth, we are in the solar system, and we are moving at that speed in the universe. And again, together with the solar system, the Earth moves revolving around the center of the Milky Way at the speed of 800,000 kilometers per hour. That's, I think, all of the time I think about that, I feel amazed and astonished. I'm inviting you, if you did not, to go into searching for the pictures made by a Finnish photographer that spent the last 12 years just to make one pictures at high resolution of the Milky Way, containing 20 million stars, from the constellation of Taurus to the constellation of Cygno. And it's a big, super big picture made of 234 mosaics of picture at high resolution. And you can really perceive this amazing magnitude in which all of us is immersed. So although there are a lot of people who spend their lives trying to hold the Earth still, I would say that the life and the experience of Galileo is helpful enough to understand that at the end of the day, revolution, and we talk about the revolution of the planets and of the orbits of the planet, is in the big things. So I think I can stop here, and thank you for your attention. And of course, I'm open for questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luciano, for this interesting presentation, in which you also showed us how Galileo started this concept of doubting things, of being able to have doubts and to work on these doubts to then get to a scientific method. We already have some questions already in the chat, but please feel free to jump in and also to ask your questions directly by raising your hand or just by jumping in. The first question that I have is from Patrizia, who asks, Galileo said, God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed word. What kind of intimate relationship did he have with the faith?
Okay, that's a very good question, because most of the time Galileo now is famous for his conflict against the church. But I think this is the wrong way of presenting Galileo, because Galileo was a man of his time and very faithful. So he actually, his daughter, that is very important for his life, was a nun. And he actually was a Catholic till the very end of his life. So he really wanted to go to Mass. I mean, all of the people more or less were believer at the time. And Galileo was a really faithful man. Of course, he was a scientist with a clear understanding of the book of mathematics in which nature is written, but at the same time, he was a believer of God. And let me say that this is important to understand, because I think that the main problem that Galileo had are really related to the fact that he was extremely faithful, because he was really sure that he was able to convince the church of the possibility of teaching and changing the understanding of the universe. So his personal relationship with the Pope was actually, I think he was a little bit too overconfident about this possibility at the end of convincing the Jesuits, the church, to change the vision about the universe and the possibility of teaching, learning, and making Copernican theory as the main theory used by the religion. I think that was a little bit too ahead of his time, and that created all the problems that we know about with the trials, Abiura, and all the stuff. But I think that the main point is that Galileo was really a big believer, and all his life shows that. I mean, he was continuing to have a personal life as a believer, and at the same time as a scientist. Is in that respect is not so different from Albert Einstein, different religions, but Albert Einstein was a sort of agnostic, never entered into the field of religion. I mean, he talks about physics and the law of the universe that may be studied by a scientist, but at the same time, always understand that there is something that is outside the scope of science. So I don't know if I answered the question, but the relationship between Galileo and religion is a very close one. So of a real believer.
And connected to this question of, Galileo's aberration, there is a question from Stefano, who asks, how is it possible that a man with such a redundant ego then agreed to retract his statements in a manner that seems a bit cowardly?
No, I don't agree. I don't think that he was a coward. I think he was very clever. Because I mean, and now I'm saying something, I take the responsibility. Giordano Bruno, another big guy, was actually burned, and everybody, actually Galileo included, had still the idea of the killing of Giordano Bruno. Okay, so everybody was a little bit scared. I mean, it was a big impression, the killing of Giordano Bruno for the time, because actually, I mean, scientists and all people understood that there was nothing to joke about that. So Galileo made the aberration, but I think it was just very rational in saying, okay, I'm aberrating, am I still working? So after the aberration, although he was confined to live his life in La Villa El Gioiello, he actually worked on the book I was mentioning at the beginning, that is considered his major legacy to science, Discorso sopra le due nuove scienze. So I think that it was not a coward action, it was a very rational action. I'm using a bad word in Italian. Galileo, after the aberration, was sputtanato. Can I use this word? Humiliated by Italian institution and the church. It was not only aberration. His name and the sentence of the trial has been read loudly on all universities in Italy. So I was really utterly humiliated, and he accepted this humiliation, but nonetheless he was able to start a school, because La Scuola del Cimento, which is a school with very young students, young scholars, between them Torricelli and other greater scientists, that started to work with Galileo. He gave up with astronomy because he needed to do that because of the sentence, and he got back on study about mechanics, about mathematics, that he left when he left Padova. So in a sense, I would say that he was even humble to understand that he was still able to contribute to science, and he gave, and I think it was a very good way to live this world, because he lived although he was grouchy in all his life, he actually reconciled, I would say, at the very end of his life with a more serene way of looking at things, because he started a school, he gave birth to a lot of research projects, and I think he left this world in a very, very peaceful way somehow. But I would not consider Galileo as a coward. I mean, if I try to put myself in his perspective, I actually sort of understand. I think it's a very rational decision, and he never gave up his ideas. He just declared to give up his ideas, but letters are there to show that he never gave up his ideas. So I think he just considered that in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it was better to survive and to spend his very last life with the daughter. And I think that this was not so wrong.
Yes, and talking about the relationship between Galileo and his daughter, David Archibald says it's most interesting. He says here, I had the pleasure of living on Via Suor Maria Celeste in Florence and walked past the astrophysics observatory every day. So perhaps if you would like to say a few more words about this relationship between Galileo and his daughter.
Let me start from a bad things about Galileo. His daughters were none, not because necessarily about fate, but because Galileo had an illegitimate relationship with a young woman in Venice when he was in Padova, with Marina Gamba, and this woman was never married by Galileo. So Galileo never married this woman and left her with 3 children. At the time, if you didn't marry, that was a big problem for reputation, because in the certificate of birth it was written nata da fornicazione, so birth because of copulation, okay? So that was really not a good certificate for a woman that was searching for a husband. Unfortunately, that was the word of the time. So Maria Celeste became a nun, but he is a very important figure in the very last days and years of Galileo, because together with the abjuration and the sentence that confined him in Arcetri, Galileo is also blind. And another great science communicator, Dava Sobel, wrote a book about the relationship between Galileo and his daughter, because the letters of the daughter to his father are actually still there, while unfortunately the letter of Galileo to the daughter have been burnt, I think because of the abjuration and something like that. And there is a very intimate and very simple relationship between the father and the daughter. So she was preparing mozzarella for his father. He was going to help her in the monastery with the small works. And she was very important in these days, in the very last years, to assist her old father. And actually, a very nice story is that after the death of Galileo and after the death of Maria Celeste, Galileo, because of the condemnation of the church, could not be buried in an official cemetery. Okay. In theory, his family was entitled to have a spot in Santa Croce, which is a very famous church in Firenze, where the big families had the possibility of burying there. And Galileo had the possibility, now is buried there, but at the beginning, for centuries, it was not possible, because Galileo, because of the condemnation of the church, was not supposed to be buried in an official cemetery. His body was conserved in the tower of Santa Croce, because the tower, I don't know if you know, it's very strange, the law in Italy, but the church is in the territory of the Vatican state, while the tower is in the territory of the municipality. So actually it could be buried there. And when they actually opened the coffin to see the rest of the body of Galileo, because they wanted to do a research, they found that he was buried together with his daughter, which so they were together. And I think that this is this shows how close, how intimate, how delicate was the relationship between the two. So I think it's very interesting to go into the personal relationship of this woman with his father. And also you can understand that the father, although grouchy, was a very, very sweet guy at the end with his daughter.
Thank you so much. And I have another question. If you want to have to ask more questions, please just raise your hand. I have one last question here. How is it possible that two opposite conceptions, such as the Ptolemaic and Copernican ones, have lived side by side for so long? Oh, he's not there anymore. We have lost him. Uh-oh. Where are you? We can't see him. What happened? Something happened. I'm so sorry. We don't have. It seems that our speaker has disappeared from the scene, and I don't know how it happened. I think there was like a glitch or something. Like we were cut off momentarily from the from the connection via Zoom, and so people are coming back, but we also lost our speaker. It's very strange. It has never happened before, and I don't know.
I'm sorry, I think eccomi qua.
So
no, I'm sorry, I think I had some problem with connection. I changed the room.
Okay. Okay, it's good. Okay, so there was one last question. If there are no others, please.
More if you want. I mean, I had problem with connection. That was the reason of my logging out.
Okay, so the question was, how is it possible that two opposite conceptions, such as the Ptolemaic and the Copernican one, have lived side by side for so long?
That's a good question. It's a question of, I would say, somehow history of science and philosophy of science. I am referring here to a very important philosopher of science, Kuhn, that Thomas Kuhn, that wrote the book Structure of Scientific Revolution. The problem is that when a new idea comes out, what happens typically, there is a sort of pattern that repeats over time, which is that when a new idea comes out, even if it has strong argument, the old community resists. And you need to think about that. There was an entire community of scientists, philosophers, intellectuals that were living and basing their life on the Ptolemaic world. So actually they start resisting on their old positions, although there are actually good reasons for the new one. And the new one affirms itself through incremental steps, and it takes some time. So for example, I mean, after the abjuration of Galileo, it took 2 other centuries for the church to admit that the Ptolemaic model was not the good one in representing the war. It takes a lot of time and lots of efforts, and sometimes also lots of problems, because, for example, people like Giordano Bruno are even killed because of the tentative to defend their ideas. So there is a bunch of motives, and it takes some time for a new pattern, a new paradigm to affirm itself. I'm a behavioral economist, and behavioral economics, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with economics, but it applies also to social sciences. So behavioral economics now is a little bit consolidated within the mainstream of social science, but at the very beginning it was perceived as sort of an heterodox theory that has nothing to do with science. And you know, it takes some time lots of people that become professor, publication in good journals. I mean, the old community gets somehow changed in time with the new contributions. And that, of course, affirms the new theory as the new paradigm. It applies to many situations, not only the Copernican revolution. I think it's really related to the way in which science advances. Now it's a little bit changed, but still, it takes some time.
Yes. And what about, I mean, the legacy of Galileo in contemporary Italy? I mean, you said, you mentioned the question of the vaccine and how people, don't, they make mistakes, between, confounding correlation with causation. But other signs of, the fact that perhaps Galileo's legacy is getting lost, getting lost in translation.
Well, I mean, a bad empirical evidence was a few years ago when, because of the diffusion of the no-vax theories in Italy, especially, Italy got big troubles with measles. I don't know if you have read about it, but a few years ago, Italy had the third biggest number of cases of measles in the world, and we are talking about absolute number, and it was third after China and India, with the difference that China and India had 1 billion of people. So we are talking about absolute number there. So we were third because actually lots of people started to share the ideas that vaccines are dangerous because they may cause autism. And this is the reason why still this is something that is very difficult to fight. So, for example, the way in which the government dealt with no-vax at the time was to introduce obligation. So actually people were obliged to get their children vaccine, otherwise they could not bring their children to school. And then the adherence to the vaccination got up again to 99%. And now we have the same problem with the vaccines against COVID. I don't know if you know him, or if you want to experience some Italian, you can go on Twitter and follow Professor Roberto Burioni. Roberto Burioni is an immunologist of the University of San Raffaele in Milan, and he's very famous because he's a great science communicator. So sometimes when I refer to Galileo, I use the example of Burioni because he has this way of sharing information, and at the same time he's very grouchy against no-vax. So sometimes it's very, very funny to read what he writes, although I'm not so sure that his way of communicating is effective. But I'm saying that he's a very clever guy, and he's very famous in Italy because there is a sort of fight in favor of scientific evidence. Again, for the vaccines of COVID, we see that there are these problems. Lots of newspapers in Italy, in a very, I would say, incosciente, how can I say?
Not rational, but irrational. Let's say irrational.
Irrational and irresponsible. Newspapers are very irresponsible in giving titles, giving huge titles to people that die after getting a jab of the vaccine. And let me clarify, all of these dead people have been proven not to be correlated with the vaccine, of course. I mean, it was, but the problem is that at some point, I'm telling you because you can laugh, but sometimes you can even cry. There was a title of a newspaper saying, imagine a title that says, dies after the vaccine AstraZeneca being investito, come si dice?
Investito in which sense?
Da una macchina.
Run over by a car.
Run over by a bus. So this person has been run over by a bus, and the title was saying he just got vaccine. And I mean, that was incredibly stupid. I mean, the problem is that it was the title of a newspaper, and kind of an important newspaper, I have to say. And the problem is that if you read these titles, lots of very simple people or maybe low educated people get the idea that there is a danger in getting vaccine. And then what happened after the block is that now people are giving up their appointments for the vaccines. So lots of people are not going to get vaccine. And we are far behind in Europe. We have lots of problems. Only 40% of 80 years old people have been vaccinated so far. And this is the reason why in Italy so many people die still each day because of COVID. So we have a huge number of dead people because 80 years people and more have not been vaccinated yet in the entire population.
Yes.
And this is a problem, of course, related also to these hoaxes, let's say.
Yeah. Luciano, really thank you for your talk, and I see Louise has something to say. Professor Canova, thank you for a well-designed and knowledgeable session. I have acquired a lot of notions. I will use Galileo heritage in my own professional field linked to linguistic anxiety versus humility, openness to mistakes, and continuous learning. So I think with this final statement, I think we can.
Thanks very much.
We can wrap up, and thanks and thank you all together for this interesting presentation. Again, we'll see each other again here on Zoom for our next events. The next one will be on the 22nd of April. It will be on Dante, honoring the 70th anniversary of his death, with a talk by a filmmaker, Max Leonida. So which will be a kind of a 3,000, so a journey across 3,000 years from Homer to Apocalypse Now, but in company of Dante. Yes, thank you so much. So thank you so much, and bye bye to everyone.
Buona giornata. Ciao ciao.
Arrivederci.
Thank you, Luciano. Grazie.
Grazie a voi. Ciao ciao.